Good morning. We are in week 3 of domestic relations class. And so we're doing chapter 3 of your textbook, which is premarital and postmarital agreements. Now, I'm going to give you a caveat. I have a cold, so I may pause this a couple times just so that I can blow my nose or sneeze or cough. So I apologize, but we'll do the best we can with this. So, we're starting with, on page 49, the introduction to what a premarital agreement is. Now, a lot of people call these prenups or prenuptials. Most states don't call premarital agreements prenuptials. They might call them antenuptial agreements. They may call them premarital agreements. Prenups is really something that came out of California and just sort of stuck because that's where these contractual arrangements began. A premarital agreement is where people who are about to get married sort of do the divorce agreement before they get married. Why would you do that? Well, in California, where all of this started, California deals with property issues differently than every other state but one in the country. And they have something called community property. And that means that if I get married, my husband, anything that he's owned his entire life becomes part of the marital estate. Now, that's different from other states. In other states, like Ohio, when you get married, what you bring into the marriage, if the marriage fails and you terminate the marriage, you keep what you came in with. And we're going to talk later about, if I come in with a car and we use that car to buy another car, we still keep track of that. Okay? So in pretty much every state, what you bring into the marriage, you leave with if you terminate the marriage. Not so much in California. In California, because it's a community property state, if I owned 5 houses before I got married, then my husband, once we got married, would also own those 5 houses. And if we terminated the marriage, we would have to divide up the value of the houses, how we were going to deal with that. Okay? And the reason why California is a community property state is to encourage people to stay married. Right? If you know you've got to split up everything that you've ever worked for. Maybe I'm getting married for the second time and I'm 50 years old and I have money in the bank and I have a retirement account and I have property. I'm going to think really hard about getting married. I'm going to make sure I make the right decision because everything that I've worked hard for my whole life is going to get split up in a community property state. Okay? When we were talking about religious marriage, I don't know if you remember, we talked about this thing called a ketubah. A ketubah is, in the Jewish faith, the precursor to a premarital agreement. And the purpose of it is to keep you married. The purpose of it is to say, boy, it's really going to stink if you get divorced, if you terminate this marriage. Because we are going to impose all kinds of costs on you. Kind of the same thing with community property in California. And in California, you've got a lot of older actors marrying young, beautiful actresses. And these young, beautiful actresses are like, heck yeah, I'll marry you. I'm going to get half of everything you got when I divorce you in 5 years. Right? And so lawyers in California said, I think we're going to find a way around community property. We're going to enter into a contractual arrangement before we get married. And in that contractual arrangement, we're going to say, you don't have any right to anything that is premarital that's mine. So if I were in California and I had 5 houses and I were to get married, I would get a premarital agreement. And remember, in the law, anytime you hear the word agreement, it means contract. So I would get a contract that said, excuse me, if this marriage terminates, guess what? You don't get any of those 5 houses. Even though the law says this is what we are going to use to divide up property when you terminate a marriage, contract law is, unless it's against public policy, unless I'm making you do something that is illegal, or unless I'm tying conditions in a premarital agreement that are against public policy, then guess what? That contract is going to supersede the statutes that say how you divide up property when you terminate a marriage. Okay? Lawyers were pretty sneaky. They figured it out. Premarital agreements are also used in California for people who live together, because there's a very famous case, Marvin versus Marvin, where Lee Marvin, who was an old actor, was living with a woman who had his last name happened to be Marvin, and she said, guess what? He promised me that if things ended, I would get X, Y, and Z. And he's like, we're not married, honey. I am sorry, but I am not doing that for you. And the courts disagreed with him. The courts said, we are going to imply a contract because she's very specific and there were factors that they looked at. But if you live together and sort of play house, you better have some kind of a contractual agreement too. Now, it's not going to be a premarital agreement because you're living together, you're not getting married. But contracts rule. And this is my theme for all of my classes. The whole world runs on contract law, on agreements, on people having a meeting of the minds. So if you're living with somebody in California, you better have some kind of an agreement that if you stop living together, this is what's going on. You go your way, I go mine. Otherwise, court might say community property attaches and we're dividing everything up just like you were married. You might have been playing house and pretending you were married, and so we're going to imply that you were. Okay? So, these premarital agreements grew out of a need to circumvent the law in California. So, do you only use premarital agreements in California? Well, no. But, you hear all the time people saying, you better get a prenup, you better get a premarital agreement. Excuse me. The truth of the matter is, there are very limited situations where it's appropriate for this kind of a contract. First of all, let's take a step back. Hi, honey, I love you very much. Will you sign this contract so that when our marriage is terminated, everybody goes their separate ways? That's quite romantic, right? It really puts a damper on a relationship when you're anticipating how it's going to terminate. So, keeping that in mind, you really have very limited situations where you want to have a premarital agreement. And again, outside of California, that's a community property state. In states that don't look at property in a community property way, you really don't need these things. When do you need them? Well, there are a couple of situations. The first is if you are in a second marriage, you're getting married for the second time, and you have adult children. Lots of times adult children think, oh, this one is going to take away my inheritance. This one is going to spend all of mom's money or dad's money. And so a premarital agreement makes everybody calm down. It makes everybody understand that this is not going to infringe on your ownership or what you think you have an ownership interest with your parent.